Cathaoirleach. Minister, I am proud to be proposing this motion this evening. I am calling on you first and foremost to publish the McHugh review immediately into the pay and allowances for student nurses and midwives. Whatever your decision, the student nurses and midwives who are outside the Dáil today deserve to know what is in this report. I welcome the measures that were announced through the Irish Times for the fourth-year interns. But I have to say, Minister, the manner in which this was announced is disappointing, to say the least. I've met with representatives of the Irish Nurses and Midwives Organisation, the Psychiatric Nurses Association and SIPTU, and they are all very angry and disappointed that there was no direct engagement with you directly and with the HSE in relation to the McHugh report and the contents of the memo that you intend to bring to Cabinet. And as usual with this government, it ends up in the Irish Times or in the media before the people who are affected by this heard about it. This is an industrial relations issue, it's bad faith, and it sours again student nurses and midwives who are part of that defence against COVID that we just spoke about earlier and, in my view, have been treated so badly. I'm concerned, Minister, from what I'm reading, that there is no real detail on the first, second and third year student nurses and midwives and their unpaid clinical placement. It does seem to suggest that the emergency €1 payment will continue for a bit longer, but I think there needs to be more detail in relation to what exactly will be put in place on a permanent basis for those first, second and third years. And it has to be real and it has to be substantial, because these people have rent to pay, they have other expenses, living expenses like the rest of us, and they need to be properly supported as they do what they do in working in hospitals as part of their placement and in the training that they do. So I think there's a responsibility on you, Minister, to ensure that all student nurses and midwives are paid a fair allowance. And I'm calling on you to urgently act on this, as actions speak louder than words. Payments for student nurses is a litmus test for this government's recognition of the contribution of those who worked in our healthcare system throughout this pandemic. And I've met many of them, in fact hundreds of them, Minister, over the course of the last number of months. And what really concerns me is how undervalued they feel. And I don't know if you appreciate that or if you have engaged with them to the same level, but it's really frightening at a time when we know we have to recruit and retain staff into our health service, that we have young people coming through training, doing placements in hospitals and feeling so undervalued and underappreciated, to the point that many of them are telling me they won't stay, and the first chance they get, they will leave. And my message to them is not to leave, to stay, because we need you in our public system. And if you are sending the same message to them, I think what you need to do is underpin that by very firm and clear action. I also have to ask you, Minister, about the recognition payment that we heard so much about for frontline workers. It was again something that was elevated before the budget. The Taoiseach and the Tánaiste was talking about it. It was expanding by the day and by the minute. Every time a minister spoke, there was more people going to get it and more public sector workers covered. And those on the front line were certainly led to believe that something would happen. Well, it didn't happen before the budget. There was then an expectation that something would happen in the budget, and of course the budget came and went, and there was no recognition, bonus or payment. And since then, over the last number of weeks, I haven't heard a peep from the government. So for all of the speculation, all of the talk that we heard, and the mixed messages even come from some in government, it's like it fell off a cliff and nobody has heard about it since. So that needs to be dealt with. The WRC have said, Minister, that you need to engage with and your government needs to engage with the Workplace Relations Commission to resolve this. And the final contribution I'll make, Minister, is in relation to safe staffing levels in our hospital. It's an area of work that I want to really support over the next while, and I'm engaging with healthcare trade unions, training bodies and others to ensure that my response in this area is fit for purpose, because we all have to have the very strongest and most robust policies and have a clearly thought out how it is we're going to recruit and train and retain more nurses, more GPs, more doctors, more consultants. But we need to do that to ensure that we have safe staffing levels. We don't have enough GPs, there are still far too many vacant consultant posts, and there are many nurses who are telling me that they are going to leave. So we need a proper strategic workforce planning strategy that's underpinned by the need to train more, but also to value them more, to treat them better, and to say to them, The Irish Public Health Service that we want to build is going to be a world-class one, but also it's one that we want you to come and work in. We value you and we want you, and that's the message that they should hear from you and your government.
Throughout the worst of the period of the pandemic, when uncertainty reigned and before so many of us got the vaccine, our hospitals were the front line in the battle against the virus. Healthcare workers, or nurses and midwives, came in to work day after day for shift after shift, putting themselves in very real danger in contracting the virus. They were very tough times for our healthcare workers and for their families. Since the widespread uptake of the vaccine, we have seen our hospitals return to a situation of immense overcrowding. The pandemic remains, but as restrictions have been relaxed, inevitably we have seen an increase in hospital presentations. An overcrowded hospital is a petri dish for infections. While our healthcare workers have been vaccinated, we need to ensure that they are given every possible protection against this debilitating virus. I welcome the announcement last night that these key workers are in line for a booster vaccine. This is an important first step in protecting our healthcare workers. Beyond that, we need to start delivering better working conditions. It's not acceptable for our nurses and other staff, such as porters and cleaners, to be working in overcrowded hospitals. It's not acceptable that nurses and other staff at my local hospital, University Hospital Limerick, are reluctant to take annual leave as they fear there's not enough staff to cover for them when they're out. It's not just good enough that we put so much burden on student nurses without having paid them adequately for the important work they did. I am pleased to see that there will be some movement on this issue. However, more clarity is definitely needed. The McGew report for too long remained unpublished and unacted on. When the student nurses saw a patient in distress, they acted. When we had healthcare workers absent due to COVID, the students stepped up. Reports suggested the government will act in relation to fourth-year student nurses, but there's no suggestion a similar action will be taken in relation to those in first or third year of their studies. We need clarity from the government, and we need a timetable as for when the recognition will be offered to some of our student nurses. The large number of healthcare workers have been out of work due to coronavirus illness is stark. Others continue to battle with the long-term impact of the virus on their bodies. Worryingly, the level of infection is increasing across the state. I just want to briefly, in the time that's left to me, the pandemic. I want to mention overcrowding, which is a massive problem in my own local hospital. 75 people are on trolleys there today. The conditions of overcrowding is unbelievable. And last week I spoke to the officials at the University Hospital with my colleague Deputy Cullinan, and they're concerned about the huge number of presentations, increased by 22% in 2019. So, Minister, I would ask you to personally intervene there.
Minister, why would someone who's not working be asked to do a 12-hour shift unless they really are working? The fact is that students plug the gaps left by a failure to invest in staffing levels. Political pressure played a key role in the beginning of the summer in securing just €100 a week to pay student nurses for the work they did during the pandemic. And I want to commend all of the students that have tirelessly campaigned, and the INMO and the Students' Union of Ireland, for the work that they have done on this issue. I met with two nurses from Limerick today that described the work they do, and they told me about how they're not allowed to work in other healthcare settings due to the cross-contamination fears. And how they've been driven into poverty by the high fees they have to pay and the high costs of trying to get to be a nurse. And I thought one of the slogans today summed it all up when they said, "Why are nurses priceless but penniless?" We need to value our nurses. They have earned that. On top of this, the WHO has also warned of the global shortage of nurses that could impact on our ability to rely on international recruitment. And we need to ensure we train and retrain as many nurses as possible into the future. Key to that is how we treat and respect nurses and midwives. That needs to start with students. We not only need to provide a fair allowance for student nurses, but we also need to increase the number of places for people who want to study nursing. The government needs to join the dots on the nursing shortages and the lack of places in colleges for young people. There is an alarming lack of planning and forward thinking. It's a testament to our young people that each year over 5,000 Leaving Cert students put nursing or midwifery as their first preference on the CAO, yet we can only accommodate around 2,000. We have both a need to and demand for these courses and places. Sinn Féin have been calling on the government to increase places by 250 this year and to continue to increase numbers until we reach 2,500 annual new entrants. Almost 4,000 students enrol in pre-nursing courses every year, but less than 5% of those get access to a degree course in nursing. Sinn Féin would also ensure a larger number of these places were reserved for students in pre-nursing levels in the state, and that nurses have a clear educational and career pathway. Minister, there's lots of things that need to be addressed.
Minister, I support this motion, and the thing that strikes me most when I speak to nurses is how undervalued they feel. And is it any wonder? Nurses who are exhausted, short-staffed, stressed, who didn't receive the childcare at the beginning of the pandemic when they were crying out for it, who had no support staff with pharmacy, no adequate security, no OT, no physio, and even no adequate catering. They were told, some that I spoke to, were told to get on with it. There seems to be no strategic vision and no strategy in the hospital groups. I think this was brought to a head and can clearly be seen when a haematologist who was recently employed in University Hospital Kerry didn't even have a microscope when he landed into work. Essential services must be kept, but you can only centralise so much. So I'm asking you, Minister, to listen to what the nurses are saying, and also to the consultants in University Hospital Kerry, in an unprecedented letter which was sent on Friday to the South West Hospital Group, had a litany of a 5-page letter demanding change in the University Hospital Kerry. Too many nurses are doing non-nursing duty. I'm asking you to employ more nurses. I'm asking you to keep the existing staff that have been there for many years by valuing them. Be flexible with those who want to work but want to work less hours. Build the isolation rooms and build more beds and wards and the cath labs and the oncology unit. 4 nurses in a 30-bed ward is unsafe. And if you can't do any of that, Minister, would you at least get them a proper staff room and changing rooms? The current situation is unsafe.
Minister, when people clapped for frontline workers, including students, nurses and midwives, that clap didn't pay a bill, it didn't pay a creche, and it didn't pay the rent. But that public display of support must be reflected by government in meaningful pay and allowances. And that payment for student nurses and midwives is going to be the litmus test of you being the Minister for Health. That contribution that they made and continue to make as we work our way through COVID must be acknowledged and must be reflected by government. But what it also does is it tells us really on whose side this government is standing. And while words matter, actions speak louder than any words ever will. And I spoke with student nurses and midwives outside earlier, and what they told me was really difficult to hear. They tell me they're tired, they're frustrated, they're exhausted, and that they don't feel heard, valued or supported. And more frighteningly, they tell me that they're thinking of leaving the country. Now, student nurses and midwives have been waiting for far too long already for this recognition. And we're bringing this motion tonight to ensure that this government, stops with the vague promises and actually delivers for these student nurses and midwives, because we will need them when they're fully trained. We cannot have a hemorrhage of these valued workers out of this country. There can be no further delays and no further excuses. It's time to stop with the lip service, and it's time to put in place what these workers need to ensure that they will be the assets in our health service in the future.
The debt of gratitude that we owe our frontline healthcare workers is immeasurable. The sacrifices that were made were immense, and the cost has been great. These were people who went into work at a time of great danger, not really knowing what they might be exposed to or bring home to their families. This was all done against the backdrop of understaffing and underinvestment by successive governments, leading to low morale and moral injury in the health service. Almost 30,000 healthcare workers have contacted COVID-19 in their attempts to help those afflicted by the virus. There were nearly 400 infections in the last month among nurses and midwives alone. The government must begin offering booster vaccinations to healthcare workers immediately. And it's been more than 6 months since many workers received their vaccinations, and they may have fallen outside the window of effectiveness. We must offer the highest level of protection possible to those fighting on the front lines, and is literally the very least we can do. We also must look at how we can recognise the particular work and sacrifices of our frontline healthcare workers. We should waive the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Ireland registration and retention fees, which are due soon. As a matter of principle, we must pay a fair allowance to student nurses and midwives for the work that they do. A fair day's pay for a day's work must apply to all. Staff have been overworked since before the pandemic and have reached a point of exhaustion beyond burnout. As a matter of urgency, we must ramp up the physical and mental health supports for healthcare workers. With hundreds of nurses suffering the lingering effects of long COVID, a pat on the back and a cheery congratulation is insulting and adds to their frustration. I don't believe that this government is taking long COVID seriously, as other countries have moved forward with supports for those who are left with long-term symptoms such as chronic fatigue, pain and the loss of lung function, while the HSE still talks around it. By not saying it out loud, do they think that nurses who can hardly climb a flight of stairs or are losing their hair will somehow get better? As a minimum, we need to put in place a clinical definition of long COVID and put proactive measures in place to support sufferers in the medium and long term.
I welcome the opportunity to speak on this motion here this evening, which is about delivering fairness to nurses and midwives in our hospitals and young nurses and midwives, and improving staff-to-patient ratios. Sinn Féin want our frontline healthcare workers to be recognised for the contribution that they make, but in particularly during COVID-19 pandemic, Minister. The motion calls for student nurses and midwives to receive fair pay, allowances immediately, and for the government to engage meaningfully, this is important, with the health and social care trade unions to deliver on pay and conditions. The nurses and midwives deliver incredible frontline services in very, very difficult conditions. Only 2 weeks ago, along with Deputy Cullinan, met with the management of Portage Hospital, and we met with Nurses Union to discuss access to care and chronic overcapacity within the hospital. And that's mirrored across the state, unfortunately. COVID admissions at Portage Hospital have doubled between October the 1st and November the 1st. Capacity issues are causing serious and severe problems in service provision. It's also putting a lot of pressure on staff, and this is impacting negatively on retention. Staff burnout, overworked, long shifts, little breaks. Nurses are going to go elsewhere, unfortunately. According to the HSE's own website, there were no ICU or high dependency unit beds available at Portlaoise on the 1st of November. There was no free beds available in those units. There was also none available ICU beds or high dependency unit beds available at Tullamore Hospital. In fact, Portlaoise ICU was at full capacity for all of October, except for 4 days. So there's only 4 days that there's any capacity there in the ICU, spare capacity. Hospitals in the Midlands are operating at 100% occupancy much of the time, and some of them are operating, Minister, slightly over this. And we have to address this. There's a range of worrying statistics, and considering this is one of them. And when you consider a range of reports, including the 2018 Sláintecare Health Service Review, recommending capacity of 80%, and my understanding is the 80% capacity is an internationally recognised figure across the OECD, that we should be at about 80% hospital capacity, that there should always be that much slack left there. We've one of the highest spending countries per capita in the OECD on healthcare. It's therefore very, very frustrating that consecutive governments have failed to be able to address the chronic capacity issues. Sinn Féin want to deliver a healthcare system that works for patients, but also a system in which nurses and midwives can build a career and can have a future. And to do this, we need fair pay for students, nurses and midwives, and adequate hospital capacity.
Garmaigat Cancorla, because this motion is about priorities, Minister. I was reminded today that since my election for the first time to this House in February 2020, on 3 different occasions, I have had to sign a form to tell the Houses of the Oireachtas that I wasn't accepting a pay rise that I never asked for and that I didn't need. And the same number of times, 3 times, this House has debated motions in respect of providing proper remuneration for our student nurses and midwives. And on 3 occasions, the government have failed to act. This chamber clapped in unison at the height of the pandemic in recognition, in solidarity and in appreciation of our frontline workers. But actions speak louder than words. And what actions needed to follow was that we recognised that the pandemic, above all else, actually exposed deficiencies that go to the core of our health services. And unfortunately, rather than the pandemic being used as a vehicle to actually undo those deficiencies, the pandemic is now the excuse for why those deficiencies remain in place. So when we talk about the difficulties in terms of capacity, the pandemic is the reason, despite the fact that in your budget, Minister, this year, there wasn't a single additional acute hospital or community bed delivered above what had already been committed. About half of the ICU beds that are actually required. Nothing from your party since you've taken over as office in relation to rebuilding our smaller hospitals such as Monaghan General Hospital, despite pre-election commitments from your party that you would actually ensure that that is the case. To my mind, this very fact that we are again debating a motion in respect of our student nurses and midwives, that you still haven't got that issue sorted on behalf of those people who stood by us through some of our darkest days, tells me quite clearly that what's needed here isn't just a shift in policy emphasis, it's a change in government. I firmly believe that these issues will only be adequately addressed when we have someone like David Cullinan in your office. I commend this motion to the House.
And I welcome the opportunity to speak on this important motion tonight. Minister, we're facing into another winter where our hospitals being overrun, and with the reality of COVID on top of all that. We need to start getting vaccine boosters to frontline staff, and I welcome the announcement from the Minister that came last night. Healthcare workers need protecting. The Minister will be judged on his actions in the next few weeks, and he needs to deliver on that commitment given. Ceann student nurses have been promised the sun, the moon and the stars by this government. The Minister has been saying all the right things when it comes to improving the conditions and the pay for student nurses. But as always, action speaks louder than words. Minister Donnelly has sat on his hands and has delayed improvements for student nurses at every opportunity. They're all too aware that they're not the top priority, but this government is making sure there's no doubt left in their minds. Ceann, we're calling for the publication of the McHugh review. It's sitting on Minister Donnelly's desk for weeks. It's time, Minister, that this report is made public. There's all talk about bringing proposals this week to Cabinet, but looking at what was leaked to the media today, it won't come close to meeting the asks of the student nurses, in particular the first, second and third years. It's a pity, Minister, that you didn't engage with their unions on this. The present situation is completely unfair, and it's gone on for far too long. Student nurses deserve fair allowances that reflect the hard work that they do to keep our hospitals moving. And this applies to all student nurses, not just those in their final year. Anything short of an improvement for them all is unacceptable, and I hope that the Minister will see sense on this.
Thanks, Count Corla. Minister, over the last 20 months or thereabouts, countless student nurses and midwives were sent into harm's way alongside all our frontline workers to fight the pandemic that came to our shores, with nearly 29,000 cases of COVID amongst healthcare workers, and many of them paid the ultimate sacrifice, Minister, in defence of their communities. And I and my family have personally felt the full impact of this, because my daughter, who is a student nurse whilst on placement, contracted COVID and brought it into our home, which wreaked devastation throughout the household. Her father, my father-in-law, her grandfather ended up in ICU, and only due to the heroic actions of healthcare workers in St Vincent's University Hospital actually saved his life, for which we are eternally grateful. And every country in the world, Minister, wants to hire Irish nurses, yet you seem to want to do your best to give them a one-way ticket and send them abroad, pushing them towards a life of eternal servitude on foreign lands. And it leads many to wonder why they are deemed priceless, Minister, yes, forced to remain penniless. Minister, in what can only be described as a cynical attempt to deflect from the government's indifference to the welfare of student nurses and midwives, you had offered a paltry €100 to them earlier this year, Minister. You had also agreed to a longer-term review of payment to student nurses on clinical placement, and that was to be led by Sean McHugh. And those recommendations, Minister, were to be with you in June, with the hopes that they will be in place for this academic year. However, that report, Minister, is still sitting on your desk since the 12th of August, and only parts of that report have been seen by a select few journalists, not by those who made contributions and took part in that review. Minister, you need to publish that report, and you need to do it immediately, and you need to pay a fair allowance to student nurses and midwives for the work that they do. And Minister, when you say you're not going to oppose this motion here tonight, that doesn't mean you do nothing. It means you must actually implement the contents of this report, because you have been found out, and you will continue to be found out if you continue to sit on your hands and fail our health service and fail our student nurses and midwives.
Thanks, Jan Corley. Minister, healthcare staff have done absolutely Trojan work since COVID first hit, and their contribution simply could never be quantified. The entire country owes them a debt of gratitude. Their hard work and dedication got us through this crisis, and they continue to carry out this work in exceptionally difficult circumstances. But levels of burnout and exhaustion are at an all-time high as healthcare workers face into another long, hard winter. Public hospitals are under enormous pressure, and staff are working in conditions where there are staff shortages, long working hours, and morale is low. Working conditions have been difficult in public health service long before this crisis, however. Underinvestment in the healthcare system has meant overcrowding, waiting lists and enormous workloads for years upon years, and there has been inaction on waiting lists which are at their worst ever levels. 900,000 people on waiting lists. The CEO of the HSE was in before the Public Accounts Committee about a month ago, and I asked him what were the chances of that figure reaching 1 million by Christmas or shortly after, and he couldn't say it wouldn't. That's an appalling legacy after 10 years in government of Fine Gael, and then with yourselves propping them up and now in government. There's also inaction on workplace disputes, including pay, access to PPE, proper air hygiene in the workplace, long working hours and overstaffing. And every single day you hear about nurses. And sometimes I wonder, when you're in government, do you ever actually stop to think of the work they've done and continue to do? And for a moment say, I'm in a position to put this right, to stand by those workers that have looked after us right through the pandemic and continue to do so under enormous pressure. Do you never say to yourself, I'll move mountains to give those staff, the nurses, the student nurses, the midwives, the fair pay allowance that they deserve. Do you never once say, I'm going to move mountains to relieve the pressure that they are under? Do you ever stop and think? Because I can only imagine, if Deputy Cullinan was in that chair, he'd start at it straight away, and you wouldn't have them having to leave busy shifts and coming up here to picket and beg for fair pay allowance. It's a disgrace, Minister.
And I want to thank my colleague Dr. David Cullinan for bringing forward this very important motion, and indeed to join with others in thanking not just our nurses and midwives but all of the workers in our health service and those who went above and beyond during COVID-19 to keep us safe. They went voluntarily into dangerous situations. They went voluntarily to where we needed them to be to keep us safe, and I don't think we can ever say enough or praise them highly enough for what they did, but because we could pay them. Nothing says I value you like indeed payment. I want to take issue with a number of deputies this evening who use the term vocation in relation to nursing. It's a job. They're not angels, they're workers. They don't have a calling, they are trained. We absolutely need them, but they don't float in on clouds to work. They unfortunately have to trudge through the traffic the same as the rest of us, and I think we need to absolutely recognise that, and I think the failure by the government to actually grasp how important the work that nurses do is because it sometimes is tinged with that sort of vocation talk, which I think is deeply unhelpful and indeed somewhat disrespectful to the men and women who are, as we all say, on the front line. I want to refer specifically to the provision in the motion with regard to mental health, and I want to reference the INMO survey because, as I've said, it is a job. It's a bloody tough job. It is a job that will absolutely take it out to you on a normal day. Pre-COVID, I represented nurses and midwives, and I was never, ever short on admiration for the work that they do. I don't know how they put themselves into those situations. In COVID, it was multiple times worse. So we see that 22% of our nursing workforce contracted COVID. 62% of them cared for people who died from COVID. And they will be dealing with that for years. What they saw, what they were forced to endure to keep us safe. I think the least the government can and should do is pay them. When they're working, pay them. It's not a hobby. It's not a vocation. And if I could just address, I understand a member of the Labour Party was in here to give out to us as the lead party of opposition. That deputy would do well to reflect on the fact that the very same nurses and midwives that we come in here to laud had their sick pay entitlement cut in half the last time their party got the chance. So that's how they treat public service workers, and we'll not take a lecture off them.
For anyone that has had the unfortunate experience of having to spend time in a hospital or who has a relative in a hospital would agree that one of the things that stands out is the dedication and care that young student nurses give to all their charges. The burden of work and responsibility laid on their shoulders is immense and should not be underestimated, as they face huge workloads while being exposed to potential COVID infection. The failure to deliver on sláinte care and to deliver a public health care system fit for purpose is a disaster and an indictment of this and previous governments. Young student nurses and midwives are the bedrock of our health service going on and into the future, and we should do everything to ensure that they continue in their commitment and dedication to our health service. Unfortunately, the treatment of student nurses and midwives in this country has led to a brain drain. It is shameful that the years of training and experience that a student nurse has acquired in Ireland will be of benefit to hospitals abroad. It is understandable that a newly qualified nurse or midwife would want to emigrate and utilise their talents in a country where they will receive proper pay and conditions and respect. There are approximately 4,500 student nurses in the country. Currently, fourth-year student nurses receive the equivalent of an annual salary of $21,749 to $22,249 for their 36-week placements in hospitals. The Government has suggested that fourth-year student nurses will now be in line for a 12.5% increase. However, those student nurses in the years below them are no less dedicated and no less hard-working, and they also helped the overstretched health service in the fight against COVID-19. So they should also be valued for their work, and as employees should receive proper remuneration for the long hours they've spent and are spending each day in hospitals around the country looking after the sick and injured. At the moment, most receive nothing or are paid a small, inadequate allowance. Protecting our frontline staff is crucial, and a rollout of a booster campaign for them is essential and welcome. Student nurses are doing indispensable work, and despite that, they are getting no proper financial recognition for this work. There are also substantial costs relating to placements, which results in an additional financial burden on students. Student nurses shall not be used as a stopgap measure for the shortfalls in our healthcare system. Thank you.
Thank you. And first of all, I want to thank all of the speakers who made contributions here today, and I think it is a really important motion. And I want to respond to some of the contributions, starting with Dr. Duncan Smith of the Labour Party, who made in his contribution and spent half of his time attacking Sinn Féin on a false assumption that we were against the remaining public health restrictions, where in fact what we're against is giving emergency powers to a minister where he makes regulations that have never come back into this Dáil for any proper scrutiny or any proper debate. And what we are seeking is that we have proper accountability and transparency. And it strikes me as a pattern from Labour Party speakers in this House that they come in, they spend most of their time attacking the opposition, looking for a pat on the head from the Minister or the Taoiseach on the Taoiseach who happens to be in the chamber, and all it shows is that they are a weak and ineffective opposition. But I want to come back to the motion and some of the points that were made in the Minister's speech, Minister for Health that is. And it was disappointing what he said on the McHugh report and on the issue of student nurses and midwives, because as was pointed out by the Cathaoirleach in her contribution, what matters is what the government are going to do, because this again is becoming a pattern where the government don't oppose a motion but they actually don't implement it either, and I think that is actually disingenuous. There's nothing in the Minister's speech where he says that he will publish the McHugh report. There's nothing in his speech where he says when he will publish the report, if indeed he will. And then he says, I will seek Cabinet approval to increase the pay of interns. He doesn't say when. He doesn't say when that's going to go to Cabinet, but he also says that he will seek approval to extend payment of the pandemic placement grant, and I will be also supporting additional recommendations. And we have no idea what those additional recommendations are, and not just us, the Student Nurses and Midwives and the Irish Nurses and Midwives organisation, who were disrespected by not being talked to and having negotiations with the government on this. They're as much in the dark as anybody else, and I think that is really disrespectful. The Minister also then, when he talks about what's actually happening in our hospitals at the moment, and I had a very lengthy exchange with the Minister earlier about the real crisis that we have with emergency department attendance up, trolley count up, and the huge waiting lists. And in his speech he says the winter plan will provide for the appropriate, safe and timely care for patients. It will not. There is nothing in this winter plan that will deal with the crisis that we have in our hospitals. It's a crisis-driven response. Every year we come to the winter, we have a real crisis in our hospitals. The government come out with a plan that actually can't be implemented because you can't magic up staff or magic up beds or magic up capacity in the winter when you're in the throes of a crisis. So all of this is just window dressing, and it's a head-in-the-sand approach. This will not substantially increase capacity, and it will not reduce waiting lists. And the head-in-the-sand approach is because what we're actually seeing is a cancellation of procedures right across the board, left, right and centre. In every hospital that I visited, they're cancelling electives and in some cases cancelling time-sensitive care. That's going to drive up waiting lists. So I have to say this ostrich-like head-in-the-sand approach from the Minister for Health, that he can come in and say his winter plan is going to provide appropriate, safe and timely care, when you only have to talk to anybody who works on the front line in any hospital in this state and they will tell you that that is simply not the case. I also want to finish by echoing what the Cathaoirleach in her contribution said, that it's really important, if the government opposes a motion, that they actually implement it. I would like to hear from the Minister for Health if and when he will publish the McHugh report. I then, more importantly, want to see what exactly is the Minister going to do. We have some sense what he's going to do for fourth-year interns. We have some sense what he's going to do for the first, second and third years for the €100 payment, which was actually unsatisfactory, but no sense of whether that's going to be permanent and what other measures are going to be put in place. And I certainly don't believe that the winter plan and the waiting list strategy or plan that the Minister has put in place is going to work. It's more this glossy brochure approach to government where we present all of these plans, but in reality it doesn't add up to anything of substance, and I don't believe that it will make the difference that it needs to make.
That concludes the debate, and the question is that the motion be agreed to.
Not agreed.
The motion is not agreed.
Well, motion agreed, sorry.
Okay, the motion has been agreed.
Acting leader is getting mixed up.
Okay, so now we'll move on. Thank you, Minister.